Since the 80s, feminists have argued that gender-biased language represents a barrier for gender equality. But how? And if so, could gender-fair language empower females and therefore perhaps improve gender equality? My name is Adina Frey, and it is these questions that I asked myself during the beginning of last year, which further led me to conduct the research that I will be presenting today. The research that I will be presenting is titled "The Use of Gender-Fair German Language by Austrian Teachers and Its Effects on Female Pupils, a study on the empowerment effect of gender-fair language." I would like to start by explaining what gender-biased and gender-fair language means, especially in the context of German. So according to academics, the use of the masculine generic represents the gravest form of gender-biased language. The masculine generics means using the masculine form rather than the feminine form to describe a general group of people or people whose gender is unknown. This phenomenon is very frequent in grammatically gendered languages such as German, where both nouns and pronouns have a grammatical gender. Let me give you an example. The noun teacher can be feminine, Lehrerin, or masculine, Lehrer, according to the gender of the person it refers to. Yet the masculine form will be used in a generic manner to talk about a group of teachers or a teacher whose gender is unknown. In contrast, gender-fair German language can take the form of feminization and neutralization. Feminization makes the inclusion of female reference explicit. Here, for example, nouns or pronouns are often coordinated by words such as and. An example would be to say Lehrerinnen und Lehrer, female and male teachers. Neutralization, on the other hand, means using neutralized forms. So, numerous empirical studies have shown that masculine generics lead to male-dominated representation in people's minds, which counters the often argued theory that the masculine generics evokes a gender-balanced mental representation. In contrast to this, a wide array of empirical research shows that the cognitive inclusion of females is higher when gender-fair language is used. However, recently, there are more studies that have been looking at the real-life consequences of various generic forms. And they found that the use of the masculine generic may actually lead to gender discrimination and therefore represents an impediment for gender equality. So, for example, a specific branch of studies looks at the effects of various generics on children and finds that, for example, girls assumes females to be more successful in stereotypically male occupations when the jobs are described with gender-fair forms, compared to when they're described in a masculine form. Or, for example, that neutral forms in stories improved girls' self-esteem compared to the masculine generic form. Yet research on the real-life effects of gender-fair language on young girls still represents only a small part of the literature, and I thus decided that I wanted to conduct more. But why is it that I believe the exploration of the effects of gender-fair and gender-biased language on girls is relevant in the realm of sustainable development? Well, Goal 5 of the SDGs calls for the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of girls and women. As I mentioned before, research has shown the negative real-life effects of masculine generic for females, and hence that language can be a barrier for achieving gender equality. Furthermore, as the goal calls for the empowerment of girls who are in a crucial phase of their development, exploration is actually needed as to whether the exposure to gender-fair language can empower girls. So what I did firstly, I needed a definition of empowerment in order to later observe whether gender-fair language could have an empowering effect on young girls. I therefore adopted the definition that female empowerment is the effect of female agency and changes in the structural barriers in ways that allow females to further increase their agency. In this, female agency is defined by 4 aspects that I've outlined in the slides. Firstly, a female voice to articulate her opinions and choices. Secondly, her aspiration. Then her self-esteem. and lastly, her ability to challenge gender stereotypes. I decided that my research was going to observe and evaluate these 4 aspects of female agencies in young females to assess their level of empowerment. Secondly, I needed to define a reference group whose gender fair or gender biased language use would be consistent and would impact young females. That's why I decided to focus on primary school teachers, and thus the effect that primary school teachers' gender fair or gender biased language could have on female pupils' level of empowerment. But why teachers? Because research has shown that teachers do have a large influence on their pupils regarding opinions and behavior, for example. Then I was able to formulate 2 research questions that guided my research. The first one being, do Austrian primary school teachers use gender fair language? And secondly, and more importantly, will female pupils consistently exposed to gender fair language by their teachers be more empowered than the female pupils exposed to gender biased language? To answer these 2 research questions, I conducted qualitative primary research in 4 Viennese primary schools, for which I received ethical approval by our ethics officers. I chose Vienna due to the fact that the language spoken, or the official language, is German, which, as I mentioned before, in German, the masculine generics is used very commonly. I conducted interviews with 7 primary school teachers of children aged 8 to 10 in those 4 schools. And during the interviews, I took note of their language use to be able to later classify it as consistently gender fair or consistently gender biased. During the interviews, the teachers were not aware that I was actually interested in their language use. Furthermore, in order to answer my second research question, I conducted focus groups with pupils from the class of 5 of the previously interviewed teachers. I chose focus groups due to the suitability of measuring empowerment. The focus groups consisted of 2 to 4 pupils. And apart from one focus group, in all other focus groups, at least 1 male pupil participated. And so even though I know the study is actually focused on female pupils, it was important for me to include male pupils just to be able to compare the behavior of the girls to the boys. You can see here that the guiding questions corresponded to the specific 4 aspects of female agency that I explained before. I'll just point out a few. So I asked questions about their occupational goals, to record their aspirations. Their ability to articulate choices and opinions was evaluated by, for example, discussing their involvement in class. I asked the females of their view on parenting tasks, which are stereotypically female tasks, to assess the degree to which they challenge traditional gender stereotypes. And furthermore, the self-esteem of the females was evaluated through their behavior, but also through their interaction with both females and male pupils during the focus group. And here I looked at the amount of words spoken compared to the male pupils, for example. So what exactly were the findings of my primary research? Concerning the first research question, I found that merely only 2 out of the 7 teachers actually use gender fair language consistently, which is in line with past experimental research that shows that only a small percentage of people use gender fair language. And now considering the female's pupil level of empowerment, my findings showed that overall, the female pupils were very empowered, and due to the already high level of empowerment, it was difficult to make distinctions between level of empowerment. Yet, the results were non-conclusive when it came to the difference between gender fair language and gender biased language exposed female pupils' empowerment, as we can see in the diagram. So for example, female students from the teacher S2T2 were very empowered, but the females of S3T1, who also spoke gender fair language, were the least empowered out of all the 5 groups, according to the imposed measurement of empowerment of the research. Yet, I believe it would be wrong to strictly assume that there was no effect of gender fair language on the level of empowerment of female pupils, as language could have positively influenced the female agency over the previous years already. However, what became obvious is that other influences beyond language were very impactful. So during the focus groups, females often mentioned their parents, and thus the impact that the parents have on their children became extremely apparent. However, due to the design of the study, this exact effect was not observable. Finally, I want to propose that future research into the potential empowering effect of gender-fair language used by teachers for a female pupil should conduct a study at one school only, and this would limit the differences between pupils' parents or the pupil's socioeconomic background, and a more clean effect of gender-fair language and gender-biased language could be observed. Thank you so much for your attention, and please do get in touch with me if you have any further questions.